Welcome in Rose City to Soccer Made in Portland. I'm Ryan Clarke, joined today by none other than Mr. Bill Oram, who is filling in for Chris Reifer, who decided to take a vacation, which, you know, why would anyone ever do that when you can talk about soccer on a podcast, right? So Bill's here. He's got his coffee. He's groggily agreed to wake up this morning at 9:30 to do this podcast. He normally rolls out of bed at like 1 p.m., you know, rattles off some Pac-12 football takes, and then, you know, kind of disappears into the night. But he's here with us this morning. So Mr. Bill Oram, welcome. And we appreciate your presence as always.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ryan. Thank you for having me. I guess we'll just let that we'll let that stand as fact that is how the father of two young boys lives life. It sounds nice. It sounds very nice.
Yeah, that would be a fantasy, right? To not be waking up early to screaming or destruction or any other distractions. I sort of sympathize, but in no way am experiencing something even close to similar, in that, you know, we have 3 dogs that wake up early and kind of bark at us in the morning. Not the same. Very easy to take care of those things compared to walking sentient little monsters that are children of human origin.
Yeah, Ryan, that sounds rough.
Get the pun counter out where it won. If only I had a little ding sound effect that would work and operate for that. But let's get going here on the different subjects of the week. Plenty of them to talk about in the soccer sphere for listeners and for people in the city of Portland. The top of the list, of course, being the story that I had this morning, an exclusive interview with Heather Davis on the Portland Thorns sale, which we have not had an update on in 8 months since Merritt Paulson announced he was going to sell the Thorns, separate, of course, from the Timbers. You know, there's a lot of complexities, a lot of different steps in the process, but there were no updates. We didn't know anything essentially about the sale, other than that there was one interested party, a group of women investors led by former Nike executive Melanie Strong. As part of this story, part of the larger story, we found out that they did not make the threshold for consideration. The perspective from the team side is that they didn't have the requisite money to invest. They didn't have enough net worth in their majority ownership to invest in the team. And from Mel Strong's group's side, they felt that the process was confusing. They didn't think it was necessarily fair to them as investors. So that's part of it. And the larger picture is that the sale is set to be completed by the end of 2023. That's according to Heather Davis, who spoke with us at length on this subject. She said that there are multiple interested parties that have made it through the qualification threshold and are now doing their due diligence and poring over the finances and the history of the team and figuring out how their purchase would work, what their bid looks like, what they're going to pay, how the team's going to have a relationship with the Timbers, all that good stuff. So plenty to unpack there. But Bill, your initial reactions to just what we now know about the Portland Thorns sale at this point.
Well, I think the most interesting thing, there were a few things, and that was a really important piece of reporting from you, Ryan, and a great story to finally get on this situation, because I think we've all been kind of sitting around saying, you said you're going to sell this team, but what are you actually doing? Where are we in that process? What does that actually look like? And the most interesting thing, I think, of course, and you mentioned it, is the status of that Melanie Strong led group. And that's not to say that was the only group that was interested early on, but really from the moment Merritt announced that he was going to sell the Thorns, that was the group that came out and said that they were interested, that they had the resources. And we're talking about a women-led, Portland-based group that was coming in to sort of, you know, with kind of this idea of saving the Thorns. And you look at the values of the franchise and the city and kind of what, you know, the Thorns have been through over the last near decade, you know, that all really lined up. It sounded it sounded good. And so to now understand that group, from the team side, like you said, didn't have the resources to actually, be the winning group is interesting and an important update. I was kind of struck by how deep of pockets they're looking for from an owner. Heather Davis said, with the way the league is going, you're seeing, with the growth of the league, you're seeing owners coming in who are, billionaires or multi-billionaires or near billionaires. And, the sense I got, from reading what you wrote was that the group that we knew about did not have anybody with that level of wealth. So it's an interesting line to draw. I'm going to be curious to see, how that plays with fans, and if fans had any attachment to that group as as coming in to as a buyer. I think it will ring hollow, or I think what would be disappointing would be to know that you had a group that came in it with, the values and, the women led aspect, local ties. And I understand that is not necessarily that's not going to be the group in the end, but then for there to be some, Florida based billionaire who comes in, it's like, but you've got the billion, and that therefore you're more qualified than this group of local women. So I'm going to be interested to see how that kind of plays out, because, at least optically, that group sounded great. It sounded like it checked every box that you would have wanted to have. Maybe short of the financial piece that the what is it, BDP Capital, the group I've never heard of and don't need to ever hear of again, is handling the sale, and what they're looking for.
BDT Capital, yes, a T there at the end.
BFD Capital is what I say.
So they're the bank that, given Hank Paulson's extensive ties in the financial world as the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, former Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. That's Merritt's father, for those who are not familiar. I'm sure most listeners are. He has those connections, and therefore they were able to, link up with BDT Capital, who recently, as an interesting aside, helped the founder of Under Armour sell $100 million worth of shares in the company, which is no small amount of money. That's small potatoes for an organization like BDT, though. In general, I think that the point that you make is an important one, right? That the fans of the club and the members of the Portland soccer community are seeking people that are more reflective of their values than what has transpired in the recent years, and the very public and serious mistakes, and frankly the animosity between Merritt Paulson and the fan base at this point, right? The relationship is frayed and negative in a two-way street, in that it's not just about the mistakes that Paulson has made and the things that fans believe are disqualifying of his ownership. It's that neither party trusts each other anymore. Neither party really seems to be on the same playing field in terms of their value system at this point. And so that was part of the draw for Melanie Strong's group, right? You saw this group of people led by Mel Strong, who was somebody that raised issues of gender equity when she was working at Nike, that put together a group of women business leaders who seemed like they would fit the bill of what an ideal Thorns ownership group would look like. That being said, it ran into the realities, I think, of the NWSL's growth and what those owners now look like, not just for Portland, not just for Merritt Paulson and the type of person or group that he is seeking, but the direction that the league is going, and that there are owners for teams like Bay FC, for teams like Chicago and OL Reign, who are also on the sale market, who are going to be purchased in no small part by near billionaires and billionaires going forward. That's something that the league has moved toward, that Heather Davis publicly stated is a preference at this point for the league, is having that more stable and deep pocketed individual in terms of net worth that can sustain the exponential growth of this league into its next decade. We've seen how far the NWSL has come in the last 11 years. And 11 years from now, it could be a really enormous sports enterprise that requires that type of initial investment or even continual investment on the part of the teams. We could see changes in ownership simply for that reason, that, you know, the owners that were there before can't just ride on the valuation of the league and the teams as it continues to go up. They need more money to invest in things that players want and deserve, like their own training facilities, like their own soccer specific stadiums, as is the case in Kansas City. And you look ahead for the Thorns in particular, that's a big driving force for the group that they want to eventually be the owners of the team. They said, and Heather Davis said in the interview, that a big part of who they decide is going to be the future owner is going to be their willingness to invest fully in the new training facility. They being Heather, Merritt Paulson, and the current brass at PTFC, they want to have the site or multiple sites on a tee for the future owners to then take over, initiate that project, pay for it in full. And that's an expensive endeavor. And it goes back to having somebody with deep pockets for something that the Thorns players have been outspoken in wanting. What do you think about that aspect? The idea that, you know, maybe Merritt Paulson is not footing that bill now, and for years has said that he was going to get the team a training facility. But now the final, I guess, move for his part is to be sort of teeing it up for the next person.
I think I get it. I think I get that, you know, that Merritt feels like this is something he wants to accomplish before he hands the team over, that he wants to set it up and not, you know, hand the team over to someone else and then not see sort of his vision come to fruition. Especially considering the timeline that we now know they are on. I think that all makes sense and is fine. I still think that, you know, in the absence of an update, the idea that they were talking, you know, a couple weeks ago about a training facility was just confounding, right? When it's like, no, your focus from a business standpoint needs to be getting this sale done. That said, if getting a training facility at least identified and getting those sites put together between now and the time a sale comes together, I mean, you still have to run the club. You still have to push the club forward. I mean, that I think the absence of, you know, of an actual training site has been a huge problem for this club throughout its 11-year history. And so being able to, you know, signal to the players that, you know, they're going to get that sooner rather than later. I think one thing you don't want to have in a sale, and, you know, I would love to, you know, be able to find a reason to pile on to Merritt for this particular thing. But I think one thing you don't want to have is have the sale, you know, gum up doing business else in other ways, to actually running the club, where the club suffers and players suffer because the sale is getting in the way of actual progress.
Right, and that dedicated training facility is not the only thing that Thorns players have expressed as wanting to be changed, right? They also desire for there to be a grass field at Providence Park, which is not something they are alone in wanting. You know, fans have called for that, but on an even greater scale, you know, Timbers players and coaches don't want that either. It's not just the Thorns that have complained about that, and there's
well, let me ask you
a
about
lot of debate. Yeah, there's a lot of debate about the injury part.
Because with the grass field, I'm getting kind of up to speed on some of this stuff, you know, after coming back up here a year ago, and I was reading back some stuff about the grass field from a few years ago, maybe around 2019, and it seemed like Merritt and the city were all pretty aligned in getting a grass field in, you know, pre-pandemic. Where has that gotten stopped up, and what role does the city play in making the transition from turf to grass?
Well, the entity that is Peregrine Sports, you know, they essentially own, well, the city owns the property, but they are the tenants and the people who operate Providence Park, right? And so the hang up from my understanding, and there will be continual reporting in the future, the hang up is multi-layered in that um, there are issues with water beneath Providence Park that certain construction would need to work around. There are issues with maintenance of grass, which is, everybody's got to deal with those. That's not an excuse by any means. There are issues of cost. There's issues of, um, lack of necessarily the weather conditions to keep the grass from sort of becoming this muddy, you know, uneven surface, and maintaining it in a way that protects it. Given the weather here, there's a reason why Seattle doesn't have one either, for that reason, and that, given our weather in the Pacific Northwest, that's one of the big challenges. Um, and there's more to it, and these are things that, people have spoken about privately, but have not quite reached the point of explaining in a public setting. And that's frustrating for fans because they want to know more about why the grass field is not going in. But I do think there is a desire on the part of Paulson and the people there, even if it has taken all this time, and they have, in the view of fans, kicked the can down the road or not shown a whole lot of interest in doing it. I think the desire is there to do that in the coming years, because you've got the World Cup coming here for the men in 2026 and possibly for the women in 2027. By then, you want to have a grass field here to be able to, while you may not have the seats for the men's World Cup to really justify being one of the stadiums that they play at, you could definitely be one of the host cities for the women's, and that, given the Thorns' support here, given the history of women's soccer in this city, that's a pretty huge motivating factor, I would imagine, to make that investment. And it's necessary. Look, you talk
Yeah,
to
like
any
why would you
soccer
want
player. Yeah.
why would you want to stay up until 2 a.m. to watch the U.S. lose to Sweden when you can just walk down the street to your neighborhood stadium to see it happen?
Right. Maybe by then, things will be different for the U.S. women's national team, and yeah, their performances have been no shortage of underwhelming in this World Cup, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the podcast. Talk about that Sweden matchup, which is going to be a rough one for Vlatko Andonovski and company, I would imagine, given these recent performances. But the grass issue is real. It's still something that people are discussing. It's not up to the future owners of the Thorns. It's up to Merritt. It's up to Heather Davis. It's up to the people in charge of the Timbers, who, as part of Peregrine Sports, they're continuing to have power over that situation, and will be renting Providence Park out to the Thorns to play. The Thorns want to play there. There's no plans for their own stadium at this point. Given the history of them playing there, they want to play there. They want to play on grass just as much as the Timbers do. And
One piece of
yes,
one piece of your story, Ryan, was about the partnership between the Timbers and the Thorns after a sale goes through. And Heather Davis mentioned, obviously they want new owners to be committed to partnering with the Timbers. What does that look like? One of the things that I've been hung up on in this whole process, and I've written as a question for this situation, is if Merritt Paulson is selling, and I know Merritt Paulson wouldn't say he's selling because he is no longer, capable of leading the franchise after the scandals that have transpired, but that is essentially it, right? Like the things that have happened under his watch have essentially been disqualifying, and he is no longer fit to own the club. Nobody's forced him to do it, but that is how we've ended up in this situation. How does that dynamic work if the Thorns maintain that partnership with the Timbers? And granted, like the Timbers, the partnership between the Timbers and the Thorns has been massively beneficial for the Thorns. It has given the Thorns, the ability to grow in, this great soccer palace on a great platform in Soccer City, all of that. And obviously that's something you want to see continue. But at the same time, the Thorns then become subtenants at Providence Park. Their landlord becomes Merritt Paulson, essentially. And so the power dynamic remains Merritt Paulson and then the Thorns below them. Is that tenable? And I guess I just wonder what that looks like going forward. Because obviously, I'm sure Merritt doesn't see a problem with that, but a lot of people who think the problem is, Merritt having control of the Thorns is the problem. That dynamic still exists if he is essentially the landlord of the club, even with new ownership.
His perspective when I spoke to him about the complexities of separating the two teams, when I talked to him about the idea that fans and yourself have raised, that selling one and not the other is, seen as a half measure, or that he would maintain power structure over the team as a result, and that misses the point. His perspective is that what happened with the U.S. soccer investigation, what happened with the NWSL investigation, and everything associated with Paul Riley, for him is not disqualifying for him to own the Thorns. His public perspective is that he's doing it because he believes that the Thorns need a fresh voice. Now that's a public perspective. That's a PR spun perspective, obviously, and I'm sure that
because he wouldn't feel that way if not for the backlash and the number of people who think that it is disqualifying.
Right, and I'm sure that factors in, and he has said as much, that the Yates report's findings factored into him making the decision. He has repeatedly said it was not a forced sale. But you are right in that it does maintain some level of power structure here between him and the Thorns, right? He still will be the person renting out Providence Park to them at, and anything other than a fair price would be perceived extremely negatively by the Portland soccer community, and any goodwill that he might have with folks would be lost, and it would affect the bottom line for first and foremost. The area that they are operating from right now, though, is one where their bottom line has been pretty much not affected by anything that has happened in the last couple of years. The butts are still in the seats. The business is doing very well. MLS is growing and going to continue to grow in the next coming years with the Apple deal, with Messi, with everything swirling around that league. The growth of the game domestically is going to make for an extremely profitable enterprise for Merritt as he continues to own the Timbers. But the power structure will still be there. He'll still not just be the person that operates Providence Park, but maintaining that partnership with the Timbers means that the owners of the Thorns, whoever they may be, are going to, on some level, have to be congenial with and work with Merritt Paulson in ways that, require him to be the person with power in that situation. He's going to be the one that has if this is somebody that's from out of town, which we don't know necessarily whether that's the case, but there's not a whole lot of billionaires walking the streets of Portland, so let's keep that in mind. But if it's somebody that's not local, it's going to be on him to help that owner or owners foster local connections, build community rapport, continue work through the Stand Together initiative, and volunteer in the community, and do the things that make the transition, in their words, seamless. But I think in a lot of ways, both players and fans don't want necessarily a seamless transition. They want very much for there to be seams that separate these two entities, that make sure that the cultural issues that have bubbled up as a result of Merritt Paulson and his executives' mistakes are separate and not impacting the experience for Thorns players and for Thorns fans in a way that is negative and does not reflect the values of these players as they continue to grow the league, as they continue to fight for their values and for equity and for what they deserve as their sport grows. So there's a lot of layers to it in terms of those power structures. But at this point for them, it is inevitable unless Merritt were to, back in December, to say that he was going to sell both the teams, divest completely, and sort of ride off into the $800 million sunset. That would have been the only scenario under which, that these type of power structures would not exist. And so how do the players navigate those power structures? How do the future owners do that? And how willing are they to bend in certain directions that may not favor what people in Merritt Paulson's camp might desire out of certain situations. So continuing on here with this subject, just the final note, 2023 is the target for completing this sale. By the end of this year is what Heather Davis said they're on track for. Multiple interested parties. That's the biggest aspect of this, I think, at this point, is that we are closer now to this happening than before. And this was our first update, so it's important for folks to know this information. There are some games happening as well. Some soccer is occurring. The Timbers, even though they lost 2-1 to Tigres in a match that Evander got a red card, there was a lot of drama. They played with 10 for the entire second half. Despite that loss,
what a couple
advanced.
Of soft yellows those were.
Yeah,
I mean, I watched that match. I subscribed to Apple TV for that match, giving hope to the Pac-12. I mean, both those were just weak yellows. So that's my contribution.
No, I agree with you generally. Speaking, in a personal capacity, I agree. That affected the game, obviously, and it will affect the next game because Evander is suspended for that red card for this game that's now coming up on Friday against Monterrey. David Bingham also suspended for going after the ref after the game. He's the backup goalkeeper at this point, but that's another guy you're going to be missing. So the Timbers look ahead to this Monterrey match, a continuation of the club being able to foster this connection with Mexican fans. There was a huge contingent of Tigres fans out at Providence Park last time, which was really fun to see. And Monterrey fans travel, I believe, in even larger numbers and are historically one of the best teams in League MX. So that is going to be fun in that aspect, but there's also the soccer to consider, which I think is going to be an uphill battle for the Timbers, not just because they are missing Evander, who is the engine that sort of makes their attack go and is unquestionably, in my view, their best player at this point. But Monterrey is a damn good team, and they hung a few goals on both the teams in their groups, including Seattle, who they beat 4-2 in the last one. Scary team for sure. And their portion of the bracket, Timbers portion of the bracket, contains pretty much all the powerhouses from Liga MX. So, the challenge isn't only to get through Monterrey, which is an uphill battle, I think. And you would imagine that Monterrey would be favored in that game. But you win that, you got to play Tigres again. And that was a darn good Tigres team, which credit to the Timbers. I think the Timbers, before the Evander red card, competed extremely well with Tigres. It was a game that was tied 1-1 at that point, but the Timbers were the first ones to score a goal. They were playing end-to-end with Tigres, defending well, except for the one lapse that led to Gignac scoring that first goal. I think that the Timbers are in good form right now. And, Chris Reifer, if he were here, he would try to reel that back and, kind of provide maybe the cynical end of it. Like, oh, well, maybe it's a flash in a pan, or, oh, well, this is fine, but they're going to run into a good team and get eliminated and it'll be over. And all of that may well be true, but I think that this stretch in particular for the Timbers has been a positive one, and something that, regardless of what happens against Monterrey on Friday, that they hope they can carry over into the remainder of the regular season. That will begin in the latter part of this month with a few new faces as well. Obviously, Miguel Araujo joined the team at the start of the transfer window. He's been around for a bit, made his debut against Tigres for just spot minutes. He's a guy that we knew was going to be a depth piece for the Timbers at center back. Additionally, you've got the addition of two other players at the deadline. The first being Brian Acosta, who was traded from the Colorado Rapids for some GAM, some general allocation money, for those unfamiliar. And Additionally, you've got Anthony, the Brazilian winger, who is going to come in. That became official today. That's somebody that is going to be in the U22 initiative, a young player who has potential to be a strong contributor for the team if he plays up to his potential. Another one named Brazilian who is going to bring plenty of potential and talent to the team as they move forward. At this point, these are two not necessarily game changing moves, but rather moves for depth and moves for the future for the Timbers. It's not going to magically fix their season, as Chris Reifer would probably be quick to note. It's not going to change maybe the issues that exist tactically for this group, but look, they made moves, and I think that these are two very positive and strong moves by Ned Grabavoy here to bring in an MLS veteran like Acosta who can add depth in central midfield, to have a veteran player in Araujo who can give you depth at center back, which they desperately needed. When they didn't have Zach McGraw, didn't have Dario Zuparic. And Anthony is a guy that, when you don't know what the future looks like for Jimmy Chara, who's had a lot of injuries, when you don't know whether Santiago Moreno is going to be somebody that's here long term, it's an important addition at this point. So transfer window, I think, has been largely a success for the Timbers, with a look ahead to future windows as ones where they might make more serious and game-changing acquisitions that are going to carry this team into the future.
Yeah, it seemed like depth. They're having some just depth issues all year, especially in the midfield. And so shoring that up and getting some guys who can come in and give them, real playable options, I think, going forward is important. I mean, Acosta is a guy I'm familiar with from my sort of casual viewership of MLS. And, Anthony and Cleopatra is one of Shakespeare's greatest works. So I'm all in.
Yeah. Not that Anthony and not the Anthony from Manchester United either, which some people have made that joke, and obviously they know it's not him. That would be a bit more of a transfer fee than I think an MLS team would be willing to shell out. Although Lionel Messi happened, so who knows? Maybe the rules are going to change. Maybe things are going to open up completely now, and it's just going to be a wild roller coaster ride in MLS. Maybe not a Hawaiian roller coaster ride. That song just popped into my head as I said that.
Ryan, you just said something I want to ask, because I admit having a surface level understanding of certain elements of MLS, and I recognize this is a real nuts and bolts podcast, but you asked to have me on. You asked me to come on here and to be myself. So I'm going to be myself. And I want to know, are we ever going to see Lionel Messi play a game at Providence Park? Is that going to happen?
If a grass field is installed before Lionel Messi retires, yes, you there's a chance you will see him here. There are multiple layers to that not being terribly likely. The first is that aging European superstars do not play on turf. Mm-hmm. They either just, admit to it and sit out and don't care what people think, or they suddenly, pick up a calf strain at training in the week leading up and they aren't available because turf is just way harder on their bodies and they don't want to add additional risk to injury when they have these illustrious careers and have played so many minutes in so many competitions over the years. So that's the big one that would obviously prevent Messi from playing on the field at Providence Park.
Okay.
The other is that they're in the Eastern Conference. Yeah. The schedule.
They don't see them until like when is the next? When are the Timbers scheduled to play Miami next? 2026.
So they could. There's no real like hard and fast rule for the matchups between Eastern Conference and Western Conference teams, but given that Portland saw Miami 2 years in a row prior to this year, it would be unlikely that they would be on the regular season docket for next season. The most likely scenario would be in Leagues Cup, either this year or next, or in the U.S. Open Cup, just as part of the random draw. The issue there is that both of those tournaments are pretty regionally organized in that, the West teams are playing the West teams, the East are playing the East. And, your best shot at seeing Lionel Messi play the Portland Timbers is more likely than not on a neutral field in a final, which, that's not Providence Park. That's a game that, given the Timbers struggles this season, would be a surprise for them to show up in, for them to end up in Vegas in that League's Cup finale against Messi, which would be awesome, obviously. And I would be spending the dollars of the Oregonian newspaper to fly to that event if it were to happen. But it's not terribly likely. So that's the tough part, right? Is that the likelihood of the Timbers even playing Messi, let alone bringing him to Providence Park and seeing him play on the field, is extremely unlikely.
So Ryan, I was at the match against Columbus when they inducted Valeri into the Ring of Honor, and they obviously pulled out an emotional victory for 3 points, ending a winless streak of 10 matches. Obviously, we're in Leagues Cup play now, so there's been kind of a gap in matches of MLS significance. But do you think that the changes they've made here in the transfer window can help them turn around the MLS season? Because I'm still looking back at the standings in MLS, and the Timbers are still, at the bottom of the Western Conference, or very near the bottom of the Western Conference.
Yeah,
is this salvageable?
Chris Reifer would say absolutely not. No question. It's over.
Love that guy.
The sky has fallen. But I love that guy too. Definitely miss him and hope he's having a wonderful time on vacation. But at the same time, I think there's a glimmer of hope. I'm always the person to say that, anything can happen. MLS is weird. Turnarounds have happened before. And the gap is not gargantuan for them to make it back into the playoff picture, particularly given the expanded 9-team playoffs in MLS now. They're 3 points out of that spot, right? But, they don't have a whole lot of games to go. There's 11 regular season matches left out of 34. It could happen if they carry the type of form that they're in right now in this Leagues Cup back into the regular season and don't drop points the way they've been dropping points all year long. Play with consistency and dynamism in a way that they have not done to this point at any point in the season, save for maybe that Seattle game where they went off, or the Vancouver win, which was pretty convincing months ago. It would take a pretty serious heel turn. I don't think that these moves at the transfer window are ones that are going to cause that heel turn. I think that they can help prop up maybe elevated performances by guys that are already here, giving them depth and reassurance that, if they go down or if they're underperforming, that maybe someone else can step in, kick the tires on Anthony, even though he's a young guy that's not maybe going to have a lot of opportunities this year. I just look, the transfer window at this point was more of, you're in the middle of the road and you're starting to sort of pick up the pieces on a veteran laden team that guys are steadily going to be coming out of the picture. Sebastian Blanco, this could probably be his last year in a Timbers uniform, either for retirement purposes or just, he moves on to another club who would be able to afford his salary given the desires competitively that the Timbers have and don't necessarily want to pay that salary next year. Larry Smabiala, Dario Zuparic, Jimmy Chara, veteran guys that have been around that may not be in the picture next year. Yaroslav Nishgoda, who has underperformed his contract greatly, not going to be around in all likelihood next year. When you're a team in transition, the transition isn't going to happen suddenly overnight. It's not like, Lionel Messi and Jordi Alba and Sergio Busquets are walking through that door the way they did for Miami. These turnarounds in MLS normally, when you don't have the GOAT and all his buddies running along with you, they take time, and it's really tiered, and you're going to hit on some signings. You're going to miss. You're going to try to find diamonds in the rough. You're going to find some rough in the rough, and eventually maybe you'll be able to rebuild the team. The question is, going forward, what the team's going to look like. Are they going to go full rebuild next year and go to more like a younger roster in MLS and see what Gio or whoever the coach is can build up from there? Or do they keep trying to make it work with some of these veteran pieces, move things around here and there, and give it another shot next year? Those are the big questions that are going to have to be answered this offseason, regardless of where they finish. I don't think this is a team in the Timbers that by any stretch is going to make an MLS Cup run. They have not shown themselves to be sort of in that level this season, and they'd like to get back there. For such a long time, the Timbers were the class of MLS, and Chris and I have talked about this before. But they seem to, in a lot of ways, be backsliding toward the middle of the pack. And, given that Portland is Soccer City, USA, given the fan support and the history that goes with this club, like, they want more, and the fans, I think, deserve more in the coming years. So that's on people like Ned Grabavoy, Merritt Paulson, others who are the stakeholders to sort of recapture the magic.
Is there any concern that at this kind of period of transition that you're talking about, that the Timbers get left behind and end up in the Mountain West Conference?
No, the Timbers will not go the way of potentially the Oregon State Beavers or Cal or some other, or Stanford or some other school that would have to slip. They're not going to slip into the USL. There's no relegation in United States soccer. That's part of why the valuations for these clubs are so enormous. So they are at no risk of that. The problem is, you are at risk of being permanently surpassed by the teams with greater investment. Now, an interesting point that I think can be brought out of this sort of jokey question is the idea of the rule changes and how they may impact the Timbers, right? Like, there are, in my view, rule changes coming in MLS. It seems inevitable at this point, given how blatantly not within the confines of the typical rules this Messi and Friends thing is starting to look. Of course, we don't know the exact details and how they fit into the rules, but it's pretty obvious that the old rules are not going to apply for Miami. And if that's the case, they're not going to apply for anybody anymore. If the other owners have their way and Don Garber is willing to listen, which I'm sure he is. What does that look like then for the Timbers with the training wheels taken off, with the challenges that they have spoken a lot about in terms of the limitation that MLS teams face financially? Is Merritt going to start throwing dollars at the wall in ways that other owners do? He may not have as deep.
All right,
pockets.
Rand, I've got a question. There we go. Because this is what I'm going to talk about. Because Merritt Paulson is suddenly high and mighty about who gets to buy the Thorns. I found it. I found the thing that pisses me off. Good. Here we go. Merritt Paulson is on his high horse about only selling the Thorns to someone who's rich enough to absorb the growth of the NWSL and the league, right? And kind of where the league is going. But is Merritt Paulson actually rich enough to be the person who carries the Timbers into this new era of MLS and the growth of the league? Is he actually looking for someone to buy the Thorns when he is not the person who can do for the Timbers what he's looking for in a buyer for the Thorns?
I think that the possibility.
I'll take my call offline.
Okay, yeah, you'll hang up and listen. So the from that perspective, I think that the idea of Merritt in a couple of years selling the Timbers separately, as their valuation goes up, as MLS continues to grow, as the World Cup comes to the US and MLS teams see a boon, I think that becomes more realistic. I think that somebody who a lot of their personal wealth is derived from this investment in the Timbers themselves and their continual growth and valuation. I think he would take that enormous check in a couple of years. That's not to say that's going to happen. That's not to say I even have a hint that that's going to happen, or that he wants that. That would probably be the time to pass the torch to somebody with far deeper pockets that could maybe throw the money at the wall and keep the Timbers as competitive. I just don't know. I don't have Merritt's, bank statements in front of me. I don't know what his level of desire for personal investment is going to look like in the new MLS. I do know that, spending $10 million on Evander is no small hit to his pocketbook, and that money isn't coming from the team's valuation. That's coming from him and from Peregrine Sports and Hank Paulson and all the money that is tied into that enterprise. We'll see. I know that Merritt's a competitive guy. I know that, he wants to, in the post Thorns Timbers combined team era, he doesn't want the Timbers to become an afterthought to the winners on the other side, the team that at this point has had far more success than the Timbers have in the Thorns. It's not about comparing the two, but he doesn't want to disappear into that good night. He wants them to compete. And the question is, are they going to be successful in that? Are they going to be able to build a competitive team in the new MLS when there are very, very rich people like Jorge Mas in Miami and like the owners of LAFC and NYCFC, and there could be foreign investment in the league, God forbid Saudi and Qatari investment in the league in the future, that could complicate those things. There is a sea change happening in MLS, and the Timbers do not want to drown in that by any stretch. The Thorns played a Challenge Cup match. They lost 2-1 to Angel City on the road, which means that they are eliminated from the Challenge Cup, something that felt close to a foregone conclusion, but obviously the Thorns did not want. They had a chance to get into the semis of the Challenge Cup as the fourth and final team, the best second place finishing team, as it were, in their group, but that was taken away from them with that Angel City loss. They're in the middle of some formation changes, trying to shift things around tactically from Mike Norris's perspective to provide more cover at the back when in transition they have defended so poorly during this stretch and not had the results that, frankly, a powerhouse team like them wants, regardless of who the personnel are that are here. It'll be nice for them to get the World Cup players back. A couple of them are going to come back sooner than others. Christine Sinclair and Rocky Rodriguez set to rejoin the team in the next couple weeks after Canada and Costa Rica were eliminated from the World Cup. That's a couple midfielders. That's nice. Nice to add legendary players and key players like that back to the group. But the issues that have bubbled up during the stretch for the Thorns are not going to just disappear magically, even when Sophia Smith and Crystal Dunn get back, even when Hina Sugita gets back after Japan wins the World Cup, which I think is a real possibility right now. Of all the teams I've watched in this Women's World Cup, and I have tried to tune into as many games as is possible given my sleep schedule, but Japan, they're the favorites for me right now. And it'd be cool to see Hina win a World Cup and come back and share that joy with Thorns fans. US, not sold. We'll get to that later. The Thorns right now, their form, their tactical changes, something to keep an eye on in the coming weeks. The regular season comes back August 20th, which is the same day as the World Cup final. So yeah, it's a lot of wait and see right now with the Thorns, and wait and see with Mike Norris as a coach, somebody who, when Chris and I have talked about this before, is working to prove himself to these players, to prove himself that he can carry the sort of on-field success and tactical strength of last year's Thorns team under Reen Wilkinson into this year, so that they can repeat. Because talent alone and culture alone, talent and culture combined, those two things aren't going to guarantee you a championship, especially this year in NWSL with so much parity.
I just wanted to quickly acknowledge what you just said about Japan and the World Cup, and I think that's just a really important point and, an encouraging one, because at the Hillsdale Public Library they have a World Cup pick the winner contest, and my 4-year-old selected Japan, and so if it's not the U.S., I'm all in on Japan, so we can win something. It's not the Hillsdale
Yeah,
the Hillsdale branch of the Portland Public Library.
I
So
see.
fingers crossed. Go Japan. Go my kid. House United.
Yeah, your kid had some serious foresight when it comes to the World Cup there. I think that that level of depth of soccer knowledge absolutely runs in the family, so it's something that you should be proud of there, having passed that on to your kin. Hina Sugita winning a World Cup, what a moment that would be. It'll be cool to chat with her in some capacity when she gets back too. I hope to do that regardless of how deep they go. I think she's a beloved personality in this community and among her teammates at this point. The Hina Hive, as they call themselves, is very real. Annie Peterson from the AP calls herself the president of the Hina Hive, and I firmly support that presidency. And shout out to Annie, also doing great work over at the World Cup. A lot more crowded in those media circles around the U.S. women's national team than it used to be, according to her and others, which is an awesome thing to see. It's too bad they've had to cover the games that they have, which has been, as we transition into this World Cup discussion, deeply underwhelming from the U.S.'s perspective, including essentially being saved by the post in that Portugal match. That shot goes in. We're talking about Soph and Crystal coming home early, and boy, howdy, they would be furious about that. And there would be some changes happening at the top of the national team, I would imagine, as a result of that. Underwhelming performances for the U.S. They come up against a Sweden team that is very good in this next match. It's like 2 a.m. on Sunday, I think, is the kickoff. They put themselves in that scenario where the game is not only tougher, but is not as viewable for U.S. audiences with that second place finish in their group. The World Cup had sort of structured like strategically without admitting so. The knockout stage matches for the U.S. to sort of fit into the window of being watchable here for those who aren't the sickos waking up at 2 a.m. But that's not the case now for the U.S. And so people will pile into the sports bra and other places around the country at 2 a.m. and sell places out like that, and they'll be there. But those are the real fans, the more casuals, which is important for the growth of the game. It's going to be tougher. Either way, pretty disappointed from what I've seen from the U.S. and coming into this tournament in the friendlies that they played and leading up to it, they just seem a little mismatched in terms of the players they have in these different positions. The tactics seem a little off. And I am not around the team enough to speak to buy-in, but there have been discussions ad nauseum, including some that I think are in bad faith about buy-in and about commitment and stuff. I just want to touch on that as sort of a main thread of all this, because the soccer itself has kind of been painful to talk about. This is an easy one. Carly Lloyd on Fox had this sort of soliloquy or rant or whatever you want to call it about the culture being sort of negative around the U.S. women's national team. And again, I don't cover this team. I'm not around them enough to know whether what Carly is saying is valid. But it comes across to me as sort of somebody that has seen their personal focus diverge from the team's overall mission and values in a way that sort of bothers them on a personal level. And it's coming out in the analysis in a way that I don't think is fair to these players. I think that these players are absolutely committed, that these players want to win, that, if they're smiling and signing autographs for children after a game that was disappointing, even though they advanced, even though they were okay in the tournament. That's fine, man. Like, it's okay that they are idols to little girls and that they are smiling and trying to cheer each other up. I even had read that from media that were there that, Crystal Dunn was sort of the one trying to lift up the young players who were hanging their heads and were frankly pissed off about the result, as they should be. But she was trying to lift them up and be like, look, we're good. Let's rebound. Let's try to keep things positive. That is not, and I think it's ignorant to say that these players are somehow ignorant in their way of the reality of the situation. I think they know that they've underperformed. I think that they're not in denial that they're just going to waltz to the World Cup. The promos that have been done about the national team where it's the US versus the world, that's not the way it is anymore. They know that too. The rest of the world in a lot of ways has caught up to the US in soccer, and we are still in the United States one of the powerhouses and the top ranked team and this, that, and the other. But it's just going to take more now than it used to. And that's a different conversation than, well, they're so busy fighting for equal pay that they don't care about winning anymore, which is what it sounded like some in the media were trying to say around this World Cup. I don't buy that for a minute, man. Let's be honest about who these people are and what they care about, and not try to attribute things to them that people in the public are aware of, let alone those who are in the know, who are journalists, who are current and former players. No. So let's dispense with that discussion.
There's also just the reality that, this is a almost entirely new team, where you are replacing many of the greatest players in the history of U.S. women's soccer. I know, Megan Rapinoe is still there and Alex Morgan's still there, but you're talking about players who are, have played in multiple World Cups and multiple Olympics and are much nearer the end. And in Megan Rapinoe's case, much nearer the end than the beginning. And so there is a newness of this, and this is still and I'm not saying that means that this is not a group that should still be expected to win, but this is a different team, and it's a different team of players who, yes, of course they've played on the international stage, but I don't know that you can necessarily expect almost an entirely new team to play up to the level of teams that have had arguably the greatest players in the history of the sport. These players are replacing those players. It is a different time, and like you said, the rest of the world has caught up. So, transition is happening everywhere, and this is just another one of them.
It is, and even if
and that opens the door for Japan,
yes,
and for my son to win a soccer ball from the Hillsdale branch of the Portland Public Library.
Yeah, that's the most important aspect of it, not all the other stuff, right? Look, it'd be hard even if they were not young, even if they were not in this transition where the people who were holding the torch in Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan, in Becky Sauerbrunn and others, even if they were not exiting stage left and making way for people like Alyssa Thompson, Sophia Smith, Trinity Rodman, and others. It's hard to three-peat, man. There's a reason it's never been done before in the history of this tournament. The U.S. still has the most World Cups on the women's side of anybody. They still are viewed as the class of the sport globally. It obviously is, from their perspective, a failure not to win the World Cup. But there have been years before where they have not done it. That doesn't mean that the U.S. Soccer Federation is in shambles or that the team is headed on a tailspin towards mediocrity. The investment that exists in soccer in this country, particularly on the women's side, is just different than it is in other countries, and will continue to be, and is growing, and that's a good thing, and the players will continue to fight for more on that front. So they're always going to be there. this is probably not their year. We'll be honest that this is somebody else's year, a Japan perhaps for library related reasons, but also just sometimes you don't have the team. Sometimes dynasties end or they have a hiccup or a break, and that's just the reality of sports. I think that you look at two all-time great players for their countries and in the club realm as well, in Marta for Brazil and Christine Sinclair for Canada. Both of them are out in the group stage. They didn't have their ceremonious final ride off into the sunset holding the World Cup trophy in the air moment. Sucks for them big time as well, if not more so than what is happening with the US, because legacies are pretty much intact for everybody in the US, and there's nobody sort of having their swan song tournament on that side, even though there are all-time great players on that side. It happens. Sports is sadness, as Portland sports fans are well aware, as much as it is, and actually more often than it is, joy and success and sustained success. And that's a tough thing for U.S. women's national team fans to grapple with, and that does not by any means excuse the poor performances of this tournament or the coaching of Vlatko Andonovski or anybody involved in what has been sort of a farce right now for the U.S. But it's reality. People just have to sort of come to terms with that.
And the other part of it, I guess I would just say, is they're through. They've advanced. They're certainly still in it. Yes, there have been some very significant red flags, but they are through. Sweden is certainly winnable, and then you move forward. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it could be, the next time I'm on this podcast, 3 years from now, we might be talking about what a triumph the 2023 World Cup was for the U.S. women. So we'll see.
Yeah, and it would be great too for a young player like Sophia Smith coming onto the world stage to have success and make her mark in that space as well. For Crystal Dunn to continue to be a vocal leader as she has on that stage for the team. We'll see. That Sweden game is on Sunday. Any parting thoughts, Mr. Oram, as we wrap things up here on the podcast?
I just, again, want to direct people to your story on the state of the sale of the Thorns. That was something that I think, again, has been, whether it's overdue or just long awaited. There's some important information in there, shares kind of the perspective of Heather Davis, Merritt Paulson as they move forward with this sale. And really, shines a little bit of a light too on the point of view of the women-led group that ended up not getting a seat at the table in this process. So I think if you've listened to this podcast, you've probably already read the story. But if not, please find your way over to Oregon Live and support Ryan's work, because that's a really important story that we've all been waiting for and excited to see this morning.
Thank you, sir. You can also find us elsewhere. Bill's works at OregonLive.com as well, talking a lot of different subjects. Dame, the Pac-12, Timbers, Thorns, what have you. It's all there. The guy is a man of many trades over there. Wears a lot of hats, and they probably fit better than mine because I'm wearing an Oregonian hat right now. People can't see that. We don't post the video. But I have to extend the hat to pretty much its like farthest possible setting in order for it to fit over my head. And once my hair gets long enough, it's like still not even possible. So there's
the roids, bro.
Yeah, I know. Big head gang over here. You can find us elsewhere on the platform formerly known as Twitter. We'll say follow us on X at Bill Oram and at Ryan T. Clarke. Catch our zeets or tweets there, I guess. Follow Soccer Maiden PDX on that platform as well for however long it exists under the dutiful leadership of dear leader Elon Musk. No, it's circling the drain. He's doing a terrible job. Also, follow the podcast.
A great example of what happens when you let billionaires buy things.
I'll leave that where it is. The podcasting platforms, wherever you get them, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Make sure to follow us on there, like us, subscribe to us, leave us a review if you so choose. Tweet at Bill Oram with some tactical soccer questions if you have them, like the most in depth and difficult questions you have. Send them his way. I think he'd be happy to answer them. That'll wrap it up for us this week. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to Bill again for being on. We will catch you next week.